Okay, so welcome to inside the negotiating hall at COP16, UN Biodiversity COP16, 16th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. And we've managed to pop in here into the negotiating hall just in a quick break between the negotiations on what is going to be the last day of the negotiations here in Cali in Colombia. And that's when it gets really exciting and scary also, when almost 200 countries around the world try and get together and reach an agreement. And it's always nerve-wracking on the last day of these COPs, and sure enough it will be today, Friday, as well. But Rob, I don't know about you, I get such a buzz coming into these rooms when you see all the nameplates of almost 200 countries here, the world coming together to try and find a common way forward on nature. Does it? It gives me such a buzz.
It's almost emotional, you know, that there's just so much energy, so many people in a room like this coming together for nature. You know, I mean, that's, you know, the negotiations are frantic at the moment. Yesterday they've been absolutely locked down. They're all in different rooms. They're working through the night. You know, let's hope they get to a final text by the end of close of play tonight. But I mean, it is just been, I mean, the whole conference has been,
it's been amazing,
quite incredible, and very exhilarating.
I find, you know, people like to, some people love to slag off the United Nations and say it's all very slow and it's bureaucratic, and I mean, it's true, of course it's slow and bureaucratic, but that's because you're trying to get almost 200 countries to agree things by consensus as a way to move forward. And what would you rather have? Would you rather try and have the countries of the world trying to agree things by consensus to move forward, or would you rather just try and go around separate ways and live in isolation?
You know, wildlife knows no borders.
Exactly.
It's got to be done at a global level. You cannot solve these problems country by country. You've got to come together. So these processes, complicated, sticky, messy, really, you know, sometimes they're arguing over commas, you know, crazy processes. But it's the only way that we can move forward as a globe to resolve the nature and climate crisis.
And each desk here, each nameplate represents a whole country. So in front of us here we've got Belize, and then, because they're in alphabetical order, we've got Belize next to Benin, next to Bhutan, next to Bolivia, next to Bosnia and Herzegovina, next to Botswana, next to Brazil, and so on. I find it so inspiring. But anyway, how are the negotiations going? I see it's getting a bit sort of squeaky bum time on the last day. And actually, what does it mean for us in the UK? Well, just yesterday, we caught up with Tony Juniper, Chair of Natural England, and we asked him a few questions just about that, about how the negotiations are going, what it means for the UK. And it's very interesting, isn't it, Rob, some of the things he was saying?
Yeah, I mean, he's, you know, well, listen to the interview, but there's some really interesting stuff, you know, build back beaver, as Boris said. Tony's got some interesting views on how we can make the global biodiversity framework work in our British Islands. So
thank you, Tony Juniper, Chair of Natural England, for taking time out of his busy schedule to speak to the wildlife trusts. Enjoy. So I'm absolutely delighted that here at the UN Biodiversity COP16 we've bumped into Tony Juniper, Chair of Natural England. And Tony, thanks so much for letting us grab you out in between meetings.
See you, Craig. Yeah, very good to see you here at this very important meeting.
Exactly. Well, how have you found the COP so far?
Well, there's an enormous amount of energy here, and this actually feels more like one of those climate change COPs where you get tens of thousands of people turning up from all sectors with masses of side events, lots of energised conversations looking at different ideas, and that kind of spirit has now entered this process on nature. So I think this is a step up really in terms of the profile of these questions on the international stage, and really encouraging to see as we look into this next 6-year period when we need to deliver the global biodiversity framework agreed 2 years ago. And so we've had 2 years out of 8, we've got 6 left, so we've had a quarter of the time so far to deliver that framework of targets. And I think it's fair to say that we're not a quarter of the way to meeting those goals yet. So this particular COP is critical in adding the momentum and the energy needed for countries to take back home to really get on with this, to really up the tempo in countries where the difference ultimately will be made.
Absolutely, and there is a lot of optimism here, a lot of momentum at this COP, stories from around the world about all the brilliant efforts being done to put nature in recovery. But of course, one of the hardest places for that arguably will be the UK. We all know that the UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, and you take those targets in the global biodiversity framework, they're really quite tough for the UK. You know, trying to get 30 by 30% of our land and sea in recovery in just 5 years' time. And this week DEFRA confirmed the definition for 30 by 30, suggesting DEFRA's definition that we're about 7%. I mean, that's a mountain to climb in the next 5 years, isn't it? Do you think it can be done?
Yes, it can be done, but we need to massively up the tempo on all of this. And the UK is a particularly challenging context in which to meet these targets, because not only is it the most nature depleted amongst the world's countries, it's also one of the most crowded. And so we have a lot of our land, obviously, in demand for agriculture, massive house building programme coming, renewal of infrastructure, industry, renewable energy, solar panels and so on. All of these things trying to crowd into that small space, which is the United Kingdom and indeed England. We can fit all that in, and it's encouraging that the government in England is going to bring forward a land use framework, which is one of the ways in which we can piece together this jigsaw of different demands, but also an opportunity to really start thinking about integrating different policies. So can we link nature recovery to house building? Well, yes, we can with the right policies. Can we link farming and agriculture to nature recovery? Yes, and that's work in progress. And actually, it's been very interesting coming here and thinking about those challenges in our small country. There's not many globally unique species or ecosystems in the UK, but one thing we can do, which has a real impact here, and I've seen it this week, is to show leadership by doing things ourselves in innovative ways and then bringing that to the global stage. And so there's two things that Natural England has been involved with nationally, which have had great interest here. So one is the idea of biodiversity net gain. Not perfect, work in progress, but that has really inspired a lot of countries to be thinking about how you can link development to actually an improvement in nature overall. And the other area, which is very challenging for many countries, is switching subsidies. And so our plan to move agricultural payments away from land managed for farming and into environmental payments for public goods, linked mostly to nature, is again an act of real leadership. So taking the momentum and the ambition from COP16, going back home, getting really stuck in, not only can we meet our own targets, but we can help to drive progress here in 2 years' time.
I mean, that is very encouraging, particularly around trying to make more space for nature, around 30 by 30 and so on. But again, if you delve into some of those individual targets in the global biodiversity framework, you have a target like, for example, halving nutrient pollution in the next 5 years. And yet we know in England we've seen house builders moaning about even being asked to stop it getting any worse. We've had, there's a target there in the global biodiversity framework to halve the harm from pesticides in the next 5 years, and yet right now we're seeing applications from the likes of British Sugar to try and get yet another derogation, in other words so-called emergency use on neonicotinoid pesticides again. I mean, the government's going to have to really stand up to some of these industry lobbies, isn't it?
Well, there's going to need to be a step change in our engagement on these subjects with different sectors, and housing and agriculture are two which are the principal sources of the nutrient issue. And so going up a step on that, I think, is really about looking at catchments, the entire landscape in which nutrients are leaking into the environment, and thinking about agriculture and wastewater treatment in those catchment scale contexts. And so this is work in progress, and we've got some good thinking on this, and actually now some real ambition to do something about the water side. And of course we have the environmental land management scheme on the agriculture side, but we're going to have to harness these two tracks of policy in a very energetic way if we're going to meet that 50% reduction, which we must do. It's causing fundamental change to ecological conditions, and that's one of the reasons why we're still seeing a decline in nature in England. Our protected areas are one thing, but the broader environmental quality, linked to nutrients included, is one of those fundamental trends that we need to put into reverse. So cutting in half, changing farming, looking at wastewater. So we need to get on with that. And then on the pesticide side, this is one of the unspoken drivers of biodiversity loss globally, really profound effects on ecosystems and the invertebrates in particular, having knock-on effects then for birds and mammals. And so we need to really get stuck into this. And, I think probably this is going to be about changing the ways in which we farm. And so I've seen across the country farmers who've recognised this and who have begun to shift their approach to agriculture. And actually one that I know in Cambridgeshire, he has drastically reduced his pesticides use at the same time as increasing yield. And so this is one of those kind of counterintuitive conclusions, because you often hear, oh, well, if we reduce pesticides, we're going to have food security issues. Well, there are farmers already showing that taking a more integrated approach, you can reduce the pesticides and increase the food output. And the way he's done that is to increase the hedges, make the margins of the fields wilder, to put beetle banks through the middle of fields to make them a bit smaller, in order that beneficial insects that predate problem insects can actually get into the middle of the field from these natural features. And so by bringing the biodiversity back, we're actually getting examples of more food being produced. And so this stuff is a bit counterintuitive still. And of course, you know, the companies that sell the pesticides, they're always going to make the case for their products. What we now need to see is some of those forward-thinking farmers also making the case for different approaches. And this is not to say everything needs to go organic, but it is to say that we do have some options that are being proven by real farmers working in real fields.
All right, well, Tony Juniper, Chair of Natural Cleaning, thanks so much for talking to the Wildlife Trust. I'll let you get back into the negotiations.
Yes, thank you very much, Craig. Very nice to see you here.
Okay, wasn't that really interesting to hear from Tony Juniper? And Tony, it was so good that you took time out of your busy schedule to speak to the Wildlife Trust. Thank you very much. Anyway, what's the latest that's been happening in the negotiations? Over to Dr. Kathryn Brown at the Wildlife Trusts to give you that update.
Thanks, Craig and Rob. So, yeah, overnight we've seen a few more draft decisions getting dropped. This means that they're going to go to the plenary today to be signed off, to be decided on. And we've seen a few more, so one on biodiversity and health, one on a review of implementation, but actually there's far fewer than you might expect at this stage of the negotiation. So we will be seeing a lot, I think, of draft text being decided through the day today. And what we're expecting is that the final plenary, so this is the final session of the conference, will be starting at 6 p.m. tonight, Cali time, which is about 11 p.m. our time. So actually we won't be seeing the conference wrapping up really until definitely the early hours of the morning. And hopefully it won't go too far past the original end date. So that doesn't normally happen because, among other things, delegates have flights to catch home. So we are expecting it to maybe go over a little bit, but not too much. And yesterday, interestingly, as we mentioned, we saw the presidency starting to get involved in some of the really tricky text, particularly on digital sequencing information and on resource mobilization as well. And what they did yesterday was they actually split delegates out into regional groups, and those groups went and negotiated the text, and that will need to come back today to see if we can get some agreement to get those sort of trickier texts really into the plenary to get them decided. And we also saw the UK getting involved. So the UK delegation got involved in the climate change and biodiversity text. Now, as you may remember from previous updates, we've seen a bit of disagreement over the mentioning of the 1.5 degree goal under the Paris Agreement. That's still in there, but it's now text that recognises the risks to biodiversity at 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming. So it's a little bit different. But we've seen the UK trying to help bridge an agreement around that text. And finally, the other thing that happened quite late last night was we saw a vote to see which country was going to host the next COP, COP17, which is taking place in 2026. And Armenia won the vote over Azerbaijan. So they were the two countries in the running. Armenia won not by that many votes, but they will now be hosting COP17. So that's interesting to see that decided. And we'll have to see what kind of agreement we get tonight to feed into that next process. So we'll be staying up quite late to see what happens. And hopefully, fingers crossed, we will see all of these trickier texts getting over the line as well. So back to Craig and Rob.
Well, Kathryn, thanks so much for that update. So this is our last update from COP16. I think Rob and I think we can say we're both feeling a bit exhausted after the last couple of weeks, but Rob, also exhilarated, eh?
Yeah.
It is exhilarating. I mean, this has been your first COP, isn't it? I'm a little bit of a COP veteran over the years, climate COPs and nature COPs, but this is your first proper COP, isn't it? And how have you found it?
I mean, a bit confusing, if I'm honest.
It is confusing.
I mean, you know, there's three bits to it. There's this negotiating hall and all the side rooms that's part of that. There's the jamboree that is the blue zone that we're in at the moment, which is a sort of trade fair for nature, which has actually been pretty brilliant. And
some
then
really inspiring stuff going on in there.
Amazing,
Yeah.
I mean, amazing talks and events I've been to. And then the green zone was, you know, genuinely inspiring in Cali itself. So, you know, it's been an incredible process, a bit difficult to know where to go at times, but an amazing process. But 2 solid weeks, and it really has been solid, 2 solid weeks talking about international nature conservation. I mean, for me, it's just fantastic.
And I think before we close, there is something that's really important to do, is I actually want to give a shout out to the civil servants, the UK negotiators, because I think we are lucky in the UK. Really, actually, whichever government's in power, we have brilliant, really professional civil service negotiators who are really good at their job in doing this. And I think they're unsung heroes in a lot of the role that the UK plays in international diplomacy, particularly around climate and nature. And I've seen it over the years in both the climate and the nature COPs. They don't get much attention, but they are recognised around the world as being really lead negotiators for the UK and really helping try and get some of the breakthrough in that. And I think we've been seeing that at this COP as well. So a huge thank you to all the teams of civil servants, the people that really work on it, often through the night, to actually make sure that the UK is making good contribution to this kind of process.
And on the subject of shout-outs, because it's our last broadcast, shout-out to the team that work behind these broadcasts.
100%.
So the staff at RSWTs, that's Joe and Liam and Kelly and the other Joe, who are editing these videos through the night in order to make sure that we can bring these broadcasts back to you. And thank you to all of you that have been listening to these broadcasts through the week. I hope you've been enjoying it.
Yeah, Rob and I just stand here and waffle on, but it's the team behind us that do brilliant work to get these updates out, and it's fantastic that thousands and thousands of you have been watching these updates. So we're going to say a fond farewell from the beautiful city of Cali in the wonderful beauty country of Colombia. What we're going to be doing is holding another one of these sort of updates in about a week's time. We'll let you know where Kathryn Brown and I will both take a bit of time to really try and assess what's come out of COP16, because it's not always obvious in the first few hours when a COP finishes. We're going to take a bit of time to really make that assessment, and also we're then going to bridge to COP29. That's the 29th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is happening just in a week or so over in Azerbaijan. And so we're going to actually look at the links between the Nature COP and the Climate COP, and then we're going to be doing a couple of updates from the Climate COP as well. We're not going there physically, but we will nonetheless be following what's going on in Azerbaijan at that COP and updating you, and particularly what it means for nature in the UK. But for now, thanks so much for joining us these couple of weeks. Bye-bye. We'll see you at the next update. We'll be talking you through COP29, and actually, in a couple of years' time, we'll be talking you through COP17, the 17th Conference of the Parties to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And remember, all these international negotiations, all these treaties, all these conventions are only as good as how they are delivered within individual countries and at home. So what we've got to do in the UK is roll our sleeves up and get delivering the Global Biodiversity Framework to put nature in recovery around the world, globally, but also at home. From Cali, thank you, goodbye.
Adios, mes amigos.